Hey everybody, my name is Dan and this is New Frame Plus, a series about video game animation. So Bioware recently released their newest entry in the Mass Effect series, Andromeda, and there's been something of a fuss surrounding it as the game has, I think it's fair to say, some surprisingly noticeable animation issues, particularly during conversation sequences.
My father's dead. He made me his successor.
Alec is dead.
Naturally, this has incited a great deal of discussion, and Bioware seems to be taking steps to address these issues, but in watching this whole discussion play out, it's occurred to me that a lot of people don't really know how dialogue animation in a game like Mass Effect works, or how these sorts of problems might happen. So this seems to me like an excellent opportunity to talk about how conversation systems work.
You can't be serious.
What's the matter? I think you're up for it.
Let's start with a broad question. How do you go about animating a game which has lots of scenes where the characters talk to each other? Well, for the best results, you would want to custom animate everything. Just like an animated film, every line of dialogue in every scene would either be animated by hand or performed in motion capture by an actor, ensuring completely unique, lovingly tailor-made performances throughout. And this is indeed the approach that some studios take, the most extreme example probably being a studio like Naughty Dog. Through a combination of extensive performance capture and hand-keyed animation, that team custom animates not only every single cutscene, but a lot of performance moments that happen within gameplay.
Sorry, pal. Come on, down here, Nate. Nate, watch out! Shit! Everyone out of the way!
Every physical action, every facial expression, all the lip sync for every character speaking every line, it's an immense amount of work and they do an incredible job of it. But this approach isn't really feasible for most games, and it definitely isn't feasible for a Bioware game. See, Naughty Dog's approach works for them because a game like Uncharted is only 8 to 12 hours long and has an almost entirely linear, predetermined story with a fairly small cast of characters. No matter what happens in-game, those cutscenes are going to play out the same almost every time, meaning that the animation team really only has to tackle around 3 hours of cinematics and maybe 6 more hours worth of interactive gameplay story sequences. The reason they can animate every scene to such a high level of quality is specifically because they've kept such tight limitations on quantity. And make no mistake, authoring even that many hours of bespoke cutscene animation to that level of polish is a huge undertaking, requiring a bunch of highly skilled performers and a much larger than average animation team. Meanwhile, Bioware is a studio known for RPGs, games with tens of thousands of lines of dialogue spoken by hundreds of different characters, games in which the player can make choices that alter the course of conversations and impact the larger story. Where Naughty Dog has to handle maybe 8-ish hours of animated conversation, Bioware's team has to tackle something closer to 40 hours. And they might custom animate a small number of particularly important cutscenes, the ones that most every player is likely to run into, but there is no way they could do that for every single permutation of those countless conversation scenes. So they need to find a different solution to the same problem. How do you animate all these dialogue scenes? That is where you need a conversation system. Let's pretend for a moment that we're talking about music. Let's say that Naughty Dog and Bioware are composers who have each been given only 1 week to write the music for a film. Naughty Dog is tasked with scoring an 8-minute short film, and they score the heck out of it. Every musical moment is carefully crafted, every note placed with intent. Bioware, meanwhile, is assigned a 2.5-hour feature. There is no way they can get this done in a week using Naughty Dog's approach, so instead, they build a huge library of reusable musical pieces, simple percussion loops, some string layers, brass layers, hundreds of simple musical elements. And they write these elements so that each piece works pretty well when layered with the others. Then Bioware starts placing those pieces, mixing and matching and layering them in different ways throughout the length of the movie. And they may not be able to make any one moment of the score work quite as well as they could if they were writing custom music specifically for those moments, but this way they are able to work much faster while more or less matching the tone and energy of any given sequence in the film. And because of this efficient workflow, they managed to score the entire 2.5-hour film in that single week. That is pretty much exactly how a conversation system works. Bioware's team builds a huge library of reusable animation pieces that are built to be layered together. Dozens of character stances, hundreds of talking gestures and facial expressions and head nods and reactions. Then they use that library to build out their conversation scenes. Like, let's see, so if the player initiates conversation with Ashley here, let's just have them both stay in standing conversation idle 1 for this chat. We'll have her start her first line with talking gesture 24.
I'm glad you're okay, Commander. The crew could use some good news after what happened to Jenkins.
Alright, that felt pretty good. Then if the player chooses the he'll be missed option, Shepard will do head nod 6 as he says his line.
Jenkins was a valuable part of this crew.
Alright, and in response, Ashley will do sad talk 3, followed by a small head nod 15.
Part of me feels guilty over what happened. If Jenkins was still alive, I might not be here.
Okay, now, if the player chooses you earned it, let's just use head nod 6 again, but this time let's follow it by head nod 1 so it doesn't feel like he's doing the same gesture every time.
You're a good soldier, Williams. You belong on the Normandy.
That works. And for Ashley's response, let's keep it small and just have her do talking gesture 2.
Thanks, Commander. That means a lot from you.
But that library of reusable animations is only half the system. Layered on top of those is a combination of procedural systems, which generate or modify animations on the fly. For example, lip sync. Animating mouths talking by hand is an extremely slow, tedious task, and utterly impossible to do for a game with tens of thousands of lines. So the animators will build another big library of mouth shapes for every phoneme, or every shape our mouth makes to form sounds for language. And they will implement a procedural system which analyzes the waveform of the dialogue audio to automatically generate lip sync animation.
I thought you said he was a drunken loser.
Couldn't hurt to go talk to him. Just be careful. I wouldn't call him reliable.
They'll also implement a head and eye tracking system so that characters can automatically turn their head and look at whoever they're talking to, or at any specific points of interest in the scene. They may also have an inverse kinematic system layered in there to make sure that character hands and feet contact uneven surfaces properly, and they'll probably have a bunch of other smaller automated things happening in there too, like eye blinks or maybe tiny eye darts to keep the character feeling alive. It's a really complex machine when you step back and look at it, an intricate combination of assembled pieces and procedural systems working together to hopefully create a good-looking, believably animated conversation. The results may not be quite as interesting to look at or have nearly as much character as any given Uncharted conversation, but it works pretty well, and it allows a moderately sized animation team to efficiently animate hundreds of conversations in a pretty reasonable amount of time. Now, Bioware has always been one of the forefront studios pioneering systems like this. Lengthy, branching conversations had been a regular feature of their games since the days of Baldur's Gate, but with Knights of the Old Republic, they tried to take those old text conversations and make them feel a little more like cutscenes. They recorded voice acting for all the dialogue. They brought the camera in closer for some basic shot reverse shots. They had the characters do these very simple talking animation cycles, and implemented some very simplistic procedural lip sync.
We can't afford any distractions. We need to find a way off Taris.
By the release of the original Mass Effect, they'd managed to add a great deal of cinematic flair to this system, with more animation variety and a more dynamic camera.
What are you waiting for? I'm standing right here. This is Fist's only chance. If he's smart, he'll take it.
And they've only continued to refine things over the course of the Mass Effect and Dragon Age trilogies. Of course, there are other game studios out there that have implemented similar systems, and I think we can all agree that the current reigning champ is CD Projekt Red with The Witcher 3. If you haven't seen it, you should, because their conversation system is breathtaking. See, one of the inherent downsides of conversation systems has always been their relative stiffness and sameness. Because each conversation and every character is getting animated with the same set of pieces, they tend to start looking and feeling pretty similar, and there's usually a lack of specificity to any given performance. And I'm not saying that The Witcher 3 doesn't struggle with that same problem, but it comes a lot closer to overcoming it than any of its competitors. Characters stand or sit in such a wide variety of stances and poses as they speak. Their gestures layer and combine in ways that feel very natural and surprisingly tied to the specifics of what they're saying.
The madding crowd dubbed me Master Mirror, or the Man of Glass.
Their facial animation is robust enough that you can actually read emotions and thoughts into their expressions. Characters will exchange meaningful looks mid-conversation, which you can actually interpret.
These are not the hands of an excellency, but of a farmer. So we speak peasant to peasant. How much can you give?
That CDPR has managed to build a conversation animation system so robust that their dialogue scenes frequently almost feel like they were custom animated is incredible. It's so successful that they almost make it look easy. But believe me, this was not easy. CDPR committed lots of resources to this system. They built over 30 different conversation stances per character type, with thousands of modifiable gestures, an impressive directional head tracking system, and all sorts of blending options. Even more importantly, they invested heavily in tools. Their dialogue scene editor is incredibly robust, and is even capable of auto-generating scenes, complete with simple gestures and camera work, which the animators and dialogue designers can then use as a baseline and a starting point, rather than having to begin that work from scratch. The designers could also easily alter these animations as needed for each character or individual scene to get even more mileage and flexibility out of their animation library. And what's more, since The Witcher 3 is an open-world game, they had to build good solutions to account for lighting these scenes so that they looked good in any time of day or weather. And they had to find solutions to keep NPCs from wandering right in front of the conversation camera. I don't think any other studio out there is currently equipped to pull off something like this. It is really incredible what that team achieved, and they deserve every compliment you can give them. Peter Tomczynski showed off their whole system at GDC 2016. You can still see it in the vault if you're interested. Anyway, you get the idea. These conversation systems are intricate machines with a lot of moving parts, all coordinating to turn a simple dialogue exchange into an engaging cutscene. And as The Witcher 3 proves, with enough resources and quality tools, the results can be pretty extraordinary. But of course, the more intricate moving parts a system has, the more susceptible it is to breakage. If any one part of a dialogue system breaks, it could potentially ruin the scene. And if you get multiple problems happening at once, the entire thing falls to pieces. Which, I guess, brings us to Mass Effect Andromeda. I'll be honest, I don't know what's going wrong with their system. I can make guesses, but without being familiar with how their particular dialogue system works, it's impossible to know exactly what's going wrong under the hood, given how complex these systems are. Now, one thing I don't intend to do here is assign blame to anybody in particular. I couldn't if I wanted to, honestly, because no one person's responsible for systems like these. Dialogue systems are a true team effort. Dozens of people had a hand in putting this system together. At first, it might seem obvious that the animators must be to blame for these problems. After all, it's the animation that's breaking, right? Well, that's possible, but weird as it might sound, I'm not entirely sure this is an animation problem. In fact, the issues we're seeing in Andromeda might actually have nothing to do with the animators. The animation team will have built all of the animations and the face expressions and all of the animated pieces that are meant to fit into this system, true, but they aren't actually the people who put all these pieces together or direct the scenes. That task generally falls to designers or cinematic animators, the same folks who decide camera placement and such. But the problems might not be their fault either. The issues we're seeing here could partially be the result of their procedural systems going haywire. The characters' eyes darting around weirdly could be bugs in their eye tracking system, with the tracker constantly switching between targets. The weird character walks and such are almost certainly a result of bugs in their IK system. And the face expression problems could be caused by any number of technical issues.
Are you for real? You were going to tell me who you are.
Assuming that their system is set up so that each line of dialogue is assigned tags determining which emotion or gestures should accompany them, it could be that there's a bug preventing the correct expressions from triggering when they're supposed to, thus resulting in these blank, expressionless faces.
Let's not forget what else happened on Habitat 7. This is powerful alien tech. We need to respect it. Go slow.
Or heck, I've even heard it suggested that this could be a compression issue, that the dialogue's emotion tag data might have gotten so compressed to fit on disk that the system's having trouble reading the tags correctly. Now you might be asking, how could they run into so many technical issues like this when they've clearly figured this all out before? They've already made 3 Mass Effect games that had none of these problems. And that's true, but one major difference between Andromeda and the previous trilogy is the game's engine, which is a major factor. The original Mass Effect was built in Unreal Engine 3, and they stayed with that engine for the entire trilogy, so each time they started work on a sequel, they already had a perfectly functional dialogue system to work with, and they could just focus on refining it and building more on top of it. But Andromeda is the first Mass Effect game built in EA's much newer and more powerful Frostbite engine, and changing engines is always a massive undertaking. All of the code and all of the assets built up over the previous games would be useless, so they would more or less be starting from scratch building Andromeda's dialogue system. I can imagine all sorts of problems that could emerge from that. But then again, Andromeda wasn't the first Bioware RPG built in Frostbite. Dragon Age Inquisition was built in the same engine, and that turned out pretty good. Now, these games' development cycles did overlap a little bit, so maybe there were limits on how much of that tech they could share, or maybe they had different goals in mind for their respective systems. Who knows? Game dev is weird. Or maybe it's not a technical issue at all. Perhaps, as veteran animator Jonathan Cooper suggested in a really fantastic Twitter thread on the subject, linked down below if you want to see it, this could have just been a scheduling and pipeline problem. It's my understanding that BioWare has tools similar to the Witcher team which allow them to generate a baseline conversation scene automatically, just to serve as a foundation for the cinematic designers to start working from. For the sake of argument, let's assume that their auto-generation algorithm exists and is pretty simplistic. It only sets up some basic shot-reverse shot cameras and does the lip sync generation. No expressions or gestures or anything. Now, during development, the team would almost certainly have had to prioritize which dialogue scenes needed the most attention, as they just wouldn't have time to go in and polish every single scene before the game shipped. This means that a fair number of low-priority scenes would probably ship in that initial auto-generated state. I imagine this was true even for The Witcher 3, because, everybody has deadlines. Maybe that's what we're seeing here. A lot of scenes that only got the auto-generation algorithm treatment. Maybe the team had originally expected the algorithm to give better results, but then the tech just didn't come together like they hoped it would, and by the time they realized it, it was too late to try a different approach. Or maybe their original intention was to go in and clean up every auto-generated scene by hand, but due to unforeseen complications, they just ran out of time and were forced to ship with a lot of unfinished scenes. Or heck, maybe they ran out of time because the schedule was just too aggressive to begin with. Maybe the publisher rushed it out the door to hit an important release window they were targeting. Or I could be entirely off base and there might be a completely different combination of problems at fault here. You can see why I'm hesitant to make guesses at this. The fact that the first noticeable improvement BioWare patched in wasn't even an animation change, but a series of character model and texture improvements to make the eyes look better, it really goes to show just how many different variables are contributing to how these conversations look. But the ultimate, unavoidable result we're left with is a game with an extremely flawed dialogue animation system, which distracts from conversations rather than enhancing them. And that's a real bummer for everybody, the game's developers most of all. I guarantee you nobody is more frustrated or disappointed over these issues than the people who poured years of their lives into making the game. Of course, it sounds like they've got plans to continue addressing these problems with some significant patches over the next few months, and I hope they'll be able to bring the game to a point that they and everybody else is happy with. We shall see. Anyway, I hope this has given you a better understanding of how modern RPG dialogue animation systems work, and perhaps even a greater admiration for the games that have triumphed in this area. While it is entirely fair to criticize Andromeda's flawed system because it's still got plenty of problems, I hope that you've at least gained some appreciation for how stupid complicated these systems are to build. Dialogue systems are complex, making games is hard, and quality expectations are a lot higher than they used to be. The more real our games start looking, the better our animation has to get, or bam, hello again, Uncanny Valley. Game development is just like this sometimes. You set out to do a new thing that you've never tried before, or you try to do an old thing in a more ambitious new way, and you plan it as best you can, and sometimes it works out great. But other times, things go wrong. You run into problems you couldn't have predicted, and before you know it, your plan has gone awry, and you've got no way to fix it before the deadline, and it just sucks. But you do learn a lot in the process. BioWare's team is no doubt already looking at the development of Andromeda with thoughts on where things went wrong and how they can avoid these missteps in the future. Whether or not it's possible for them to completely fix Andromeda's problems, I look forward to seeing this team's next attempt. If you found this interesting, this episode was largely inspired by an Animator roundtable I did with veteran animators Gwen Frey, Tim Borelli, and Simon Unger, which I will link to below. Those three made a lot of great observations, some of which I shamelessly borrowed here, but not all of them, so definitely go read that. And additional special thanks to Gwen, Tim, and Simon, as well as Mike Jungbluth and Christian Jonjuk for their input and feedback on this episode's script. It was invaluable. If you'd like to learn more about game animation and see an example of a game where everything came together brilliantly, check this other episode I made about Punch-Out for the Wii. The animation in that game is really, really good. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll be back soon with more New Frame Plus. See you then.